The 911 call came in at 11:52 p.m., a fractured whisper slicing through the late-night static of Atlanta's emergency dispatch. It was a woman's voice, thin and frayed with a terror so palpable it felt like ice water in the dispatcher's veins. "He knows, Julian, he knows everything." The words were choked off by a strangled sob, then a piercing shriek that was brutally silenced by the flat, percussive cracks of 2 gunshots. Then, nothing. Just the dead air of a disconnected line, pregnant with the horror of what had just happened. Detective Isaac Ike Thorne felt the familiar knot tighten in his stomach as the call details buzzed on his department-issued phone. A double homicide, or maybe worse, in the Sovereign, a glass and steel spire that clawed at the Buckhead skyline. It wasn't just a building, it was a vertical neighborhood for the city's 1%ers, a place where the air itself seemed filtered through money. Ike took a long drag from his lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste doing little to cut through the weariness that had settled deep in his bones. At 48, with 25 years on the force, he'd seen the worst of Atlanta, from the grimiest back alleys of the Bluff to the manicured lawns of Druid Hills. But a call from the Sovereign was different. It meant spotlights, political pressure, and a level of scrutiny that could scorch the paint off a squad car. Driving up Peachtree Road, the city lights blurred into a river of gold and neon. The Sovereign loomed ahead, a monument to a world Ike observed but never belonged to. As a black detective who'd worked his way up from street patrol, he was a constant navigator between 2 Atlantas, the one of legacy and inheritance, and the one of struggle and grit. This case was planted firmly in the former. He flashed his badge at the stone-faced security guard at the gate, who looked at Ike's 10-year-old Ford sedan with the kind of disdain usually reserved for insects. The air in the underground garage was cool and silent, smelling of clean concrete and expensive leather. It was a tomb for Bentleys and Teslas. The elevator ride to the 47th floor was a silent, unnervingly smooth ascent. The penthouse. Of course. When Ike stepped out, the scene was already a controlled chaos of blue uniforms and the quiet, methodical movements of the forensics team. The air was thick with the acrid tang of gunpowder, a scent that never failed to smell like the end of something. He nodded to his partner, Detective Lena Petrocelli, a sharp, no-nonsense woman half his age who was already taking notes. "What a mess, Ike," she said, her voice low. "Victims are Dominic Pierce and a Jane Doe. Looks open and shut." Ike pulled on a pair of latex gloves, the snap against his wrist a familiar ritual. "Nothing's ever open and shut on the 47th floor, Lena." He stepped inside. The penthouse was an ocean of white marble, floor-to-ceiling windows, displaying a breathtaking, indifferent panorama of the city. A grand piano stood silent in one corner. A sculpture of twisted metal gleamed in another. It was a space designed to impress, to intimidate. And now, it was a tomb. In the center of the vast living room, on a plush white rug that now looked like a desecrated flag, lay the bodies. Dominic Pierce, the tech mogul whose face was plastered on business magazines, was slumped in an opulent armchair. A single dark hole marred his temple. His expensive suit was immaculate, save for the blood. A few feet away, sprawled on the rug, was the woman, young, beautiful, wearing a silk dress that clung to her lifeless form. A dark stain blossomed over her heart. A silver handgun, a sleek Sig Sauer, lay near Dominic's outstretched hand, his fingers loosely curled as if he'd just dropped it. It was a perfect tragic tableau, the powerful man, the beautiful mistress, the final, fatal argument. It screamed jealousy, rage, and regret. A story as old as time, just with a much higher price tag. "Me puts time of death around an hour ago, consistent with the 911 call," Lena said, reading from her notepad. "Concierge didn't hear a thing. Soundproofing in this place is probably military grade." Ike walked a slow circle around the scene, his eyes missing nothing. The 2 wine glasses on the coffee table, one with a lipstick smear. The overturned vase of lilies, water pooling on the marble. The way Layla Sands, they'd identified her by the driver's license in her purse, had fallen, almost gracefully. It was all too clean, too staged. It felt less like the chaotic aftermath of a passionate crime, and more like a carefully composed photograph. His gaze settled on the gun near Dominic's hand. The grip was clean, the position unnatural. It was as if someone had placed it there, a final prop in a grim play. He crouched down, his eyes scanning the floor, the furniture, looking for the one thing that didn't belong, the single discordant note in this symphony of death. And then he saw it. Tucked away near the kitchen entrance, almost hidden by a chrome trash can, was a small, almost invisible scuff mark on the pristine marble. A drag mark, as if something or someone had been moved. His gut clenched. This wasn't a murder-suicide. This was an execution, gift-wrapped to look like a tragedy. The question wasn't what happened here. It was who wanted them to believe this story. The narrative is simple. Captain Miller barked over the phone the next morning, his voice already strained by the media frenzy. Pierce finds out his girl is stepping out, or maybe she threatens to tell his wife. He snaps, kills her, then himself. Keep it clean, Ike. The Pierce family practically owns half the city council. Ike listened, his eyes fixed on the crime scene photos spread across his cluttered desk. The images were stark, clinical. Dominic Pierce, a titan of industry reduced to a forensic exhibit. Layla Sands, a life of promise extinguished on a $1,000 rug. It's too clean, Captain, Ike said, his voice a low rumble. The scene feels polite. A crime of passion is messy. This is housekeeping. Your gut feelings don't write my reports, Miller retorted. Find the evidence to support the narrative. The wife is on her way to the morgue. Handle it. The line went dead. Ike hung up, the captain's words ringing in his ears. Support the narrative. It was a phrase he'd come to despise. It meant finding the easy answers, not the right ones. He turned back to the photos, his mind replaying every detail of the penthouse. He remembered the faint, almost imperceptible scent of bleach he'd caught near the kitchen threshold, a smell completely out of place amidst the expensive perfume and gunpowder. The forensics team had swept the area and found nothing, but the scent lingered in his memory. It was a cleaner's smell, an eraser's smell. He zoomed in on a photo of the coffee table. The two wine glasses stood side by side. The bottle of expensive Bordeaux next to them was half empty. It looked like an intimate evening that had taken a tragic turn. But something about the placement was off. They were too perfectly aligned, too parallel. In the chaos of a fatal argument, things get knocked over, spilled. These glasses looked like they had been set down by a librarian. He then remembered the drag mark, small but significant. It was near the kitchen, away from the main scene. He made a note to have the forensics team go back and analyze the flooring composition in that specific area to see if any foreign fibers were embedded in the scuff. It was a long shot, but long shots were his specialty. His focus shifted to a detail the initial sweep had overlooked as insignificant. The penthouse had a state-of-the-art trash compactor built into the kitchen island. Most of the night's refuse would have been crushed into a neat little block. But the small, elegant wastebasket in the adjacent powder room was a different story. The first responders had glanced in, saw nothing but a few tissues, and moved on. Ike, however, had insisted they bag everything. Now, the contents were laid out in a sterile lab downtown. He picked up the phone and called the lead technician. Anything from the powder room trash at the Pierce scene? Just some used tissues and a cotton ball, detective, the tech replied. No blood, no DNA other than what you'd expect. Did you check inside the tissues? Ike pressed. Unfold them, carefully. There was a pause, then the faint crinkling sound of paper over the phone. Hold on. Yeah, there's something here. Looks like paper shreds, tiny pieces like from a micro-cut shredder, but a few are big enough to read. Another pause. It's letterhead, from Emory Medical Center. I can make out a few words. Results, confidential, patient name, D. Pierce. And, hold on, I see 3 letters here, clear as day. H-I-V. Ike felt a jolt, a sudden electric clarity. This was it, the catalyst. Dominic Pierce, a man who projected an image of invincible power and health, was HIV positive. It changed everything. It wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about a life-altering, reputation-shattering secret, a secret that could unravel a carefully constructed empire. A secret someone might kill to protect, or a secret that might drive a man to murder the person who gave it to him. The official narrative suddenly seemed plausible again, but for a much darker, more profound reason. Pierce gets the diagnosis, realizes Layla infected him, and in a fit of rage and despair, he ends both their lives. It was a powerful motive, But Ike's gut still screamed no. The bleach, the stage glasses, the drag mark. These were not the actions of a man lost in a storm of emotion. They were the calculated steps of a killer trying to cover their tracks. Someone else had been in that penthouse. Someone who knew Dominic's secret. He stared at the whiteboard in his office, where he'd pinned photos of the victims. A new question began to form, eclipsing all others. Who else knew Dominic Pierce was a dead man, walking long before the bullets ever left the gun? The secret wasn't just a motive for Pierce himself. It was a motive for anyone who stood to gain from his silence, or his death. He thought of the 911 call. He knows. Julian, he knows everything. Who was Julian, and what exactly did Dominic know? The perfect crime scene had just developed its first fatal flaw. The pieces of that shredded medical report were not just evidence. They were a map leading away from the easy answer and into the dark, hidden heart of the Pierce dynasty. The Pierce estate was less a house and more a sovereign territory carved out of the green hills of Tuxedo Park. A fortress of old Georgia brick and blinding white columns, it stood behind a wrought iron gate tall enough to repel a cavalry charge. Ike drove through the gates, the crunch of gravel under his tires sounding like an intrusion. Manicured lawns rolled away on all sides, dotted with ancient oaks dripping Spanish moss. It was the kind of obscene, generational wealth that made the sleek modernity of the Buckhead penthouse look like a child's toy. This was the seat of the empire. A severe-looking housekeeper in a black dress led him through a cavernous foyer with a checkerboard marble floor and a chandelier that could have lit a small town. He was instructed to wait in the drawing room, a space dominated by a massive fireplace, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and the heavy scent of lemon polish and old money. Serafina Pierce entered the room with a silence that was more commanding than any shout. She was tall and slender, her blonde hair pulled back in an elegant, severe chignon. She wore a simple but exquisitely tailored black dress, a single strand of pearls her only adornment. Her eyes, a pale, crystalline blue, were red-rimmed, but she moved with a composure that was both admirable and deeply unsettling. She looked every bit the grieving widow, a portrait of tragic grace. "Detective Thorne," she said, her voice a low, cultured whisper. She gestured to a silk-upholstered armchair. "Thank you for coming." "Mrs. Pierce, my deepest condolences for your loss," Ike began, taking the offered seat. The chair was uncomfortably soft, swallowing him in its plush depths. "My husband was a complicated man, detective," she said, sitting ramrod straight on the edge of a matching sofa. "He had appetites. I learned long ago to look the other way. It was part of our arrangement." The confession was delivered with the emotional detachment of a CEO discussing a quarterly report. "So, you were aware of his relationship with Ms. Layla Sands?" Ike asked, keeping his tone even. "I was aware that he had a Layla Sands in his life. The name's changed, but the type never did. Young, impressionable, disposable." The last word hung in the air, sharp and cold. Ike felt a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. He was not just a detective here, he was an employee, a functionary from a world far removed from hers. "Your arrangement, did it have limits?" "The only limit was discretion, detective, a limit Dominic frequently tested." A flicker of something hard and bitter crossed her face before being smoothed away. "He was becoming reckless." Ike decided to push. "Mrs. Pierce, we have reason to believe your husband was dealing with a serious health issue. Did he ever discuss his medical status with you?" Serafina's composure didn't crack, but Ike saw a tightening around her pale blue eyes, a subtle clenching of her jaw. "If you are referring to his recent diagnosis, yes, I was aware. He told me last week." "And your reaction?" "What would you expect my reaction to be? Pity? Anger?" She gave a small, humorless smile. "We hadn't shared a bed in years, detective. My health was never at risk. I saw it as the inevitable consequence of his lifestyle, a bill finally coming due." The callousness was breathtaking. She spoke of her husband's HIV diagnosis, as if it were a poorly managed investment. "Did he tell you who he thought infected him?" "He was convinced it was that girl, Layla. He was incandescent with rage, not because of the disease itself, but because of the betrayal, the carelessness of it. He felt she had contaminated him, his legacy." Ike leaned forward slightly. Where were you on the night of the murder, Mrs. Pierce? Between 11 p.m. and midnight. I was at the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's annual gala, she replied without hesitation. I was a co-chair of the event. I was on stage giving a speech until 10:30, and I remained at the reception until well after 1 a.m. There are hundreds of witnesses, including the mayor. You'll find my name on the program. It was an alibi forged in iron, presented like a shield. He nodded, making a note. She was untouchable. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that her grief was a performance, her composure a mask. He decided to play one more card. The 911 call from your husband's apartment mentioned a name, Julian. Does that name mean anything to you? For the first time, Serafina's mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something, was it fear, recognition, in her eyes before they turned to ice again. Julian Croft, she said, her voice a little too steady. He was my husband's business partner, his closest friend. I imagine Dominic would have called him in a moment of crisis. They were like brothers. Were you close with Mr. Croft? He is a friend of the family, nothing more. She stood up, a clear dismissal. Now, if you'll excuse me, detective, I have funeral arrangements to make. My husband, for all his faults, deserves a dignified exit. As the housekeeper showed him out, Ike glanced back. Serafina stood perfectly still in the center of the grand room, a solitary figure framed by the immense wealth around her. She looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. A kingdom she now ruled alone. Driving away from the estate, Ike couldn't shake her image from his mind. Her alibi was perfect. Her story was plausible. But he had seen that flicker in her eyes. He knew she was hiding something. And as he passed back through the imposing iron gates, leaving her world of curated grief and cold marble behind, he knew that this case had just become infinitely more dangerous. He wasn't just investigating a murder, he was challenging an empress. The fluorescent lights of the precinct interrogation room cast a sickly, sterile glow on Maya Warren. She was the opposite of Serafina Pierce in every way imaginable. Where Serafina was composed and cold, Maya was a wreck. Her nurse's scrubs wrinkled, her face puffy from crying. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand like a lifeline, her body trembling with a grief that felt raw and painfully real. I can't believe she's gone, Maya whispered, her voice cracking. I told her this would end badly. I told her. Ike sat across from her, his presence calm and grounding. He'd learned long ago that in these moments, silence was a more effective tool than any question. He let her speak, letting the dam of her sorrow break. Layla, she wasn't what people thought, Maya began, looking up at Ike, her eyes pleading for him to understand. Everyone saw the pretty girl with the rich man and just assumed, gold digger, trophy. But she was just lost and scared. Scared of what, Ms. Warren? Ike asked gently. Maya took a shaky breath. Of being nobody. Of going back to the life we came from. We grew up together in College Park, you know. Not exactly the country club set. Layla saw Dominic as her way out. A permanent escape. Tell me about their relationship. Was she in love with him? A bitter laugh escaped Maya's lips. She was in love with the life he gave her. The penthouse, the clothes, the feeling of being important. But Dominic, he was a transaction, a means to an end. She paused, her gaze dropping to her hands. That's why she didn't tell him. Didn't tell him what? Ike pressed, though he already knew the answer. Maya's shoulders slumped in defeat. About her status, her HIV. She found out about a year ago, a routine checkup. It destroyed her. Her voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. I'm a nurse. I was the one who went with her to get the results. I begged her, Ike, detective. I begged her to tell him, to tell all her partners. It's the law, it's the right thing to do. But she refused, Ike stated. She was terrified, Maya said, fresh tears rolling down her cheeks. She knew he would drop her in a second. The fantasy would be over. She'd be back to square one, only now she'd be sick and alone. So she convinced herself it was okay. She was on medication. Her viral load was undetectable. She told herself the risk was minimal. But the risk was never zero, Ike said grimly. And Dominic found out. Yes, Maya nodded. About a week ago. Layla called me in a panic, Dominic had gotten sick, gotten tested, and the results came back. He knew. He had confronted her. She said he was like a monster, that she'd never seen such rage in a person's eyes. This confirmed Serafina's story. It provided Dominic with a powerful, explosive motive. The case for murder-suicide was getting stronger by the minute, a neat package tied up with the ribbons of rage and betrayal. Ike felt a sinking feeling, the pressure from his captain to close the case echoing in his head. "Is that all, Ms. Warren?" he asked, preparing to wrap up the interview. Was there anyone else Layla was close to? Anyone else she might have confided in? Maya hesitated, twisting the shredded tissue in her hands. There was something else, something she told me after Dominic found out. Ike waited, his posture alert. This was it. The detail that didn't fit. She said she wasn't just going to let him throw her away, Maya said, her voice low and conspiratorial. She was desperate. She said she had a plan. She was going to make him pay for everything, not just for the anger, but for all the times he made her feel small, like an object he owned. What kind of plan? She was going to blackmail him, Maya admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush of shame. She had proof of some of his shadier business dealings, things he'd told her in confidence. She was going to demand $5 million to disappear and keep her mouth shut about the diagnosis and the business. Ike's mind reeled. Blackmail. This wasn't just a scorned lover. This was an extortionist. The motive for Dominic to kill her had just magnified tenfold. It wasn't just rage anymore. It was self-preservation. Preserving his health, his reputation, his freedom, and his fortune. Did she go through with it? Ike asked, his pen flying across his notepad. Yes. The night it happened. She called me just before she went to the penthouse. She was going to give him the ultimatum. I told her it was crazy, that it was dangerous. Dominic Pierce was not a man you cornered. Maya started to sob again, her body shaking. She said she wasn't afraid. She said, "I've got nothing left to lose, Maya, and everything to gain." Ike sat back, the new information settling like a shroud over the case. It all fit. Layla confronts Dominic, demands millions. Dominic, already furious about the HIV, completely snaps. He kills her to silence her, and then, seeing no way out of the scandal and the disease, he turns the gun on himself. It was a clean, logical, and deeply tragic conclusion. It was the story his captain wanted, but one thing still bothered him. The 911 call. He knows. Julian, he knows everything. Why would Layla mention Julian's name in her final moments? Was she trying to warn Julian? Or was she warning someone about Julian? And what did he know? Everything about the HIV, the blackmail? Or was there another, even darker secret that had been buried with them in that penthouse? Maya Warren had just handed him the perfect motive to close the case, but she had also unknowingly pointed him toward a shadow that still lurked just out of sight. Julian Croft agreed to meet at his office, a sleek, minimalist space in a midtown tower that bore the Pierce corporate logo. The view from his window was a rival to the one from Dominic's penthouse, a testament to his own success and his proximity to power. When Ike walked in, Julian was standing by the window, his back to the door, a silhouette against the afternoon sun. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his sandy hair perfectly coiffed. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine ad for success. When he turned, his face was a carefully constructed mask of grief. His eyes were shadowed, his expression somber. He shook Ike's hand, his grip firm, but his touch cold. "Detective Thorne," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "This is a nightmare I can't seem to wake up from. Dominic was more than my partner. He was my brother." "I understand this is difficult, Mr. Croft," Ike said, taking a seat. "I appreciate you making the time." "Anything to help find clarity," Julian said, sitting opposite him. "Anything for Dom." Ike started with the basics, asking about the business, about Julian's long-standing relationship with Dominic. Julian painted a picture of a deep, unshakable friendship forged in the fires of ambition. They had met in business school and built their tech empire from a garage startup into a billion-dollar behemoth. According to Julian, their bond was the bedrock of the company. "Were you aware of Dominic's relationship with Layla Sands?" Ike asked. Julian sighed, running a hand through his hair. I warned him about it. Dom had a blind spot for beauty. He was brilliant in the boardroom, but reckless in his personal life. I told him a girl like that from her background, it was a risk. The casual condescension in his tone was almost identical to Serafina's. It was the language of their class. And were you aware of his recent health diagnosis? Julian's face tightened with what looked like genuine pain. Yes. He called me the day he found out. He was destroyed, utterly destroyed. It was the first time I'd ever heard real fear in his voice. He paused as if gathering himself. He was convinced Layla had infected him. The rage, it was biblical. I'd never seen him like that. Did he talk about what he planned to do? He was talking crazy, Julian said, shaking his head. Lawsuits, public ruin. He wanted to scorch the earth around her. I tried to talk him down. I told him a public scandal would hurt the company, hurt his family. I begged him to handle it quietly, to just cut her off and walk away. This corroborated what Serafina had said, painting a consistent picture of Dominic as a man on the edge. When was the last time you spoke with him? Ike asked. The night of the murder, Julian said, his voice dropping. He called me around 10 p.m. He was frantic. He said Layla was on her way over. He told me she was trying to blackmail him. This was the critical confirmation. He told you about the blackmail attempt? Yes, Julian said, his eyes locking with Ike's. He said she wanted millions to keep quiet about his diagnosis and some other business indiscretions. He was laughing, this wild, unhinged laugh. He said, "She thinks she can corner me, Jules. She has no idea who she's dealing with." I told him not to do anything rash, to wait until morning so we could talk to the lawyers. He said he would handle it. Then he hung up. Julian leaned back, the picture of a man haunted by his friend's last words. I should have gone over there. I should have stopped him. The story was seamless. It fit with Maya's testimony, it fit with Serafina's, and it fit the evidence of a man pushed past his breaking point. Julian Croft had just delivered the final, damning piece of the puzzle. The case was all but closed. Ike packed his notebook, ready to leave. He stood up and offered his hand. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Croft. This has been very helpful." "Of course, Detective," Julian said, shaking his hand again. "Just find the truth for Dominic." As Ike turned to leave, he paused at the door. An old detective's trick, the parting shot. "One last thing," he said casually. "Ms. Sands made the 911 call. She mentioned your name before she was killed. Any idea why?" Julian's smooth facade didn't crack, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "I can only imagine she was panicked. Dominic was probably screaming at her. Maybe he mentioned my name, said he was going to tell me about the blackmail. In her terror, my name was the last one she heard. It was a plausible, logical explanation. Too logical." Ike nodded slowly. "Probably right." He walked out, the heavy office door clicking shut behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the cool wall, replaying the conversation in his head. Julian's performance had been perfect. His timeline was tight, his emotions believable. His story cemented the official narrative. But Ike couldn't shake a profound sense of unease. It was too perfect. Julian hadn't just answered questions, he had provided a complete, self-contained narrative, conveniently explaining every loose end, including his own name being on the 911 call. It felt less like a grieving friend's testimony and more like a script being read aloud. He thought back to the confidence in Julian's voice, the calculated sorrow in his eyes. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. He was a man in complete control. Ike's gut, the one his captain so readily dismissed, was now screaming louder than ever. Julian Croft wasn't just a witness in this tragedy. Ike was becoming convinced he was the author, but proving it felt like trying to punch a hole in a wall of granite with his bare hands. The next 48 hours were a study in frustration. The official report was already being drafted on Captain Miller's desk, a neat and tidy summary of the Pierce case, a tragic domestic dispute culminating in a murder-suicide, motivated by infidelity, disease, and a final, desperate act of blackmail. The media had run with the narrative, painting Layla Sands as a venomous gold digger who had pushed a great man to the brink. It was a clean, simple story that satisfied the public's appetite for scandal among the rich and famous. For everyone at the precinct, the case was closed. Everyone except Ike Thorne. He felt like he was wading through a thick, suffocating fog. Every piece of concrete evidence, every testimony pointed to the same conclusion. Serafina's alibi was airtight. Maya's confession about the blackmail provided the motive. Julian's final phone call with Dominic was the emotional tipping point. The pieces all fit together perfectly, and that's what drove Ike crazy. Real life was messy. Real crimes had frayed edges, inconsistencies, lingering questions. This case had none. It was a sealed box. He sat in his office late into the night, the city lights of Atlanta a cold comfort outside his window. He stared at the whiteboard, at the faces of Dominic, Layla, Serafina, and Julian. He had nothing. No physical evidence placed anyone else at the scene. The partial drag mark he'd found was dismissed as inconclusive. The faint smell of bleach was undocumented and amounted to nothing more than a detective's hunch. His suspicion of Julian and Serafina was pure intuition, inadmissible in any courtroom and laughable to his superiors. Captain Miller called him into his office. The door was closed, a bad sign. "Ike, I'm signing off on this," Miller said, not bothering with pleasantries. He tapped a thick folder on his desk. "The DA is satisfied. The Pierce family's lawyers are satisfied. The only person who isn't satisfied is you." "The case feels wrong, Captain," Ike said, his voice low but firm. "Julian Croft's story is too neat. Serafina Pierce's grief is non-existent. They're hiding something." "What they're hiding is a family's worth of dirty laundry, which isn't our problem," Miller shot back. "Our problem is a double homicide, and we have a logical, evidence-based solution. We don't have the resources or the political capital to go on a fishing expedition based on your gut. Let it go. That's an order." Ike felt a cold anger rise in his chest. An order. The final word. He knew what it meant. Pushing this further wouldn't just be insubordination, it would be career suicide. The Pierce family had the kind of influence that could make a decorated detective disappear into a desk job in the archives until retirement. He was being warned off, clearly and unequivocally. He walked out of the captain's office, the weight of the order pressing down on him. He could follow it. He could sign the report, close the file, and move on to the next body, the next tragedy. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. But as he looked at the picture of Layla Sands, young, scared, and now demonized in her death, he couldn't do it. Someone had executed her and her powerful lover and was about to get away with it. Someone had played them all for fools. Justice for Layla and Dominic demanded more than the easy answer. He made a decision. It was a reckless, defiant gamble that could cost him his badge. He picked up his phone, but he didn't call forensics or the DA. He called a number he hadn't used in years, the direct line to the head of the Atlanta PD K-9 unit, a grizzled old-timer named Mac. "Mac, it's Ike Thorne," he said, keeping his voice low. "I need a favor, off the books." "Off the books is my middle name," Mac grunted. "What do you need?" "I need your best nose," Ike said. "I need Zeus." Zeus was a legend in the department, a magnificent German shepherd with a sense of smell so acute he could supposedly detect a single particle of contraband in a hurricane. He wasn't a drug dog or a bomb dog. Zeus was a specialist, trained in cadaver recovery, and more uniquely, evidence detection, specifically finding objects with trace human scents that had been missed by traditional methods. A scene that's already been processed and swept? What are you hoping he'll find, Ike? A ghost? "I'm hoping he'll find the one thing everyone else missed," Ike replied. "I have a warrant for the penthouse that's still valid for another 12 hours. I'm calling it a final sweep. I need you and Zeus there in 1 hour. No sirens, no lights. Can you do it?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mac knew what Ike was asking. He was asking him to risk his own neck, to go against the grain of a high-profile case that command wanted buried. "You know, Thorne," Mac finally said, a reluctant admiration in his voice, "you've always been too stubborn for your own good. I'll be there in 45 minutes. Don't let Zeus lick the damn marble. It gives him gas." Ike hung up, a jolt of adrenaline cutting through his exhaustion. He was disobeying a direct order. He was betting his career on a hunch and a dog's nose. It was either the smartest or the stupidest thing he had ever done. As he grabbed his keys and headed back to the silent, sterile penthouse on Peachtree Street, he knew one thing for sure. The fog was about to lift, or it was about to swallow him whole. The penthouse was just as they had left it, a silent, cavernous space cordoned off by yellow tape. The bodies were gone, the blood had been scrubbed from the rug by the cleanup crew, but the ghost of the violence lingered. The air was cold and still. Ike stood by the door as Mac entered, followed closely by Zeus. The German Shepherd was a stunning animal, all muscle and focused intelligence, his ears erect, his dark eyes scanning the room with an intensity that was almost human. He wore his K9 unit vest, a symbol of his specialized purpose. "All right, boy," Mac said softly, his voice a low rumble. "What have they been hiding from us? Such Zeus? Find?" The command was calm but firm. Zeus didn't bark or bound into the room. His movements were deliberate, methodical. He started by sniffing the perimeter, his nose hovering just an inch above the marble floor. He completely ignored the large white rug in the center of the room where the bodies had been, the area that had been the focus of all human attention. He bypassed the coffee table, the grand piano, and the blood-spattered armchair, which had been left in place for documentation. It was as if he was tuned to a different frequency, searching for a scent signature that was fainter, more discreet than the obvious stench of death. Lena Petrocelli stood beside Ike, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "You really think he's going to find something our guys missed?" "Our guys look for what they expect to find, Lena," Ike said, his eyes never leaving the dog. "Zeus doesn't expect anything. He just smells what's there." Zeus continued his slow, meticulous sweep, moving from the living area toward the sleek, minimalist kitchen. He paused at the spot where Ike had noticed the scuff mark, sniffing intently for a few seconds before moving on. He was working his way toward the far wall, where a massive dark mahogany wine cabinet stood, a floor-to-ceiling piece filled with hundreds of bottles of expensive wine. It looked heavy, immovable, a permanent fixture of the room. The forensics team had dusted its exterior for prints and moved on. There was no reason to think anything could be behind it. Suddenly, Zeus stopped. He stood perfectly still in front of the wine cabinet, his body rigid, his tail straight. A low whine escaped his throat. Then, he let out a sharp, definitive bark. He looked back at Mac, then back at the cabinet, and barked again. He began to paw at the floor, his claws making a soft scratching sound against the marble, right at the tiny, almost invisible gap between the side of the cabinet and the wall. "What's he got, Mac?" Ike asked, moving closer. "He's got a strong scent hit," Mac said, his eyes gleaming with professional pride. "Something that doesn't belong. It's concentrated right there, in that crevice." Ike and Lena exchanged a look. The cabinet was enormous, easily weighing over 1,000 pounds with all the wine inside. Moving it would be a monumental task. "All right, let's do it," Ike said, rolling up his sleeves. He, Mac, and Lena positioned themselves around the heavy piece of furniture. On the count of 3, they pushed with all their might. The cabinet groaned in protest, scraping against the floor as it moved, inch by agonizing inch. It took several minutes of grunting and straining, but they finally managed to shift it about a foot away from the wall. The space behind it was coated in a thin layer of dust, untouched for years, except for one spot. Right where Zeus had been scratching, the dust was disturbed, and nestled in the narrow gap between the floor and the wall molding, something sparkled under the beam of Ike's flashlight. Lena knelt, pulling an evidence bag and tweezers from her kit. She carefully plucked the object from its hiding place. It was a single earring, a delicate platinum stud holding a diamond so brilliant it seemed to pulse with its own light. It was small, elegant, and astronomically expensive. It was also undeniably a woman's earring. It was not something Layla Sands with her trendy modern style would have worn. This was old money. This was generational wealth. Ike's heart hammered in his chest. He pulled out his phone and brought up a photo he had downloaded from the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra's website, a picture of the event co-chairs from the night of the murder. There, smiling serenely for the camera, was Serafina Pierce, and dangling from her left ear was a diamond earring, the identical twin to the one now sitting in Lena's evidence bag. Lena looked up at him, her eyes wide with realization. Holy hell, Ike. Serafina's alibi, the ironclad, unimpeachable story of being at a gala surrounded by the city's elite, had just been shattered by a single, misplaced piece of jewelry. She hadn't been at the party the entire night. She had been here, in this penthouse. She had lied. Ike looked over at Zeus, who was now sitting patiently, accepting a quiet word of praise from Mac. The dog had done more in 10 minutes than the entire police force had in 3 days. He had smelled the truth. He had found the ghost in the machine. This case wasn't just open again. It had just exploded, and Ike was now holding the match. The discovery of the earring changed the case from a static portrait into a rapidly moving picture. The energy in the precinct crackled with a new, urgent intensity. Captain Miller, faced with undeniable physical evidence, had no choice but to back Ike's play. The condescension in his voice was replaced by a grudging respect. The murder-suicide theory was officially dead and buried. They were now hunting a killer, or killers, who had been hiding in plain sight. "The earring is a match," the lab tech confirmed over the phone, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Not just in design, but we lifted a trace DNA sample from the post. It's a familial match to Dominic Pierce, consistent with being worn by his wife. And there's more. We found a microscopic fiber caught in the clasp. A cashmere fiber, dyed a specific cobalt blue." Ike was already one step ahead. "The dress Serafina Pierce wore to the gala," he said, looking at the photo on his screen. "It was cobalt blue. Get a warrant for that dress." The next move was to dismantle Serafina's alibi, piece by painstaking piece. Ike and Lena spent the next 12 hours interviewing dozens of gala attendees, from waiters to millionaires. The story was consistent. Serafina had been a radiant, charming hostess. But under pressure, a few key witnesses provided the cracks Ike was looking for. A caterer remembered her slipping out a side door near the kitchens around 11:10 p.m., saying she needed a moment of fresh air. A valet, when shown her photo, recalled a woman matching her description, getting into a black town car, not the Pierce family's official chauffeured vehicle, at approximately 11:15 p.m. She had returned, he said, looking slightly flushed just before 1 a.m. It was a 90-minute window, more than enough time to get to Buckhead, commit murder, and return. The alibi was broken. Now they needed the conspiracy. If Serafina was there, she wasn't alone, Ike said, pacing in front of the whiteboard. This was a clean scene, controlled. That's not a one-person job, not for someone in a gala dress. His eyes settled on the photo of Julian Croft, the loyal friend, the perfect witness. The name whispered in the 911 call. Let's dig into Croft. Let's dig deep. They started with his financials, pulling warrants for his bank accounts, credit cards, and investment portfolios. On the surface, everything was pristine. Julian Croft was a wealthy man, his fortune tied directly to the success of the company he'd built with Dominic. But one of Ike's financial analysts, a young prodigy who could read a balance sheet like a novel, found the anomaly. It was a series of structured cash withdrawals over the past 6 months. Small amounts, always just under the $10,000 federal reporting limit from a personal savings account. In total, nearly $100,000 in cash had been quietly siphoned off. It was the kind of activity associated with blackmail payoffs or funding a secret life. Then came the real bombshell. Using cell tower data, they triangulated the locations of Serafina and Julian's phones for the past 3 months. While their days were spent in their respective orbits of work and high society, their nights told a different story. At least twice a week, their phones would ping at the same location, usually for 2 to 3 hours after 10 p.m. The location wasn't a restaurant or an office. It was a discreet, high-end residential hotel in Midtown that was known for its privacy. They weren't just friends of the family. They were having an affair. The motive snapped into focus with blinding clarity. It wasn't just a crime of passion over Dominic's infidelity. It was a cold, calculated plot born of greed and betrayal. Dominic wasn't just an unfaithful husband or a compromised partner. He was an obstacle. "It all makes sense now," Lena said, her voice a mix of awe and disgust. They were together. If Dominic divorced Serafina, especially with his cheating, she would get a hefty settlement, but she wouldn't get control of the company. Julian would remain the number 2, always in Dominic's shadow. But with Dominic dead, Miss Serafina inherits the controlling shares as his widow, Ike finished, the pieces clicking into place. And who does a grieving widow turn to for help in running her late husband's empire? His loyal, trusted partner, Julian Croft, her lover. Together, they get everything: the money, the power, and each other. The HIV diagnosis and Layla's blackmail attempt hadn't been the cause of the murder. They had been the opportunity. It was the perfect cover story, a plausible, dramatic narrative to hide their own cold-blooded ambition. They had used Layla's tragic secret to frame a dead man, turning the victims into the perpetrators. Ike looked at the web of connections on the board. The lines of deceit, greed, and lust all converged on Serafina and Julian. He now had the motive, the means, Serafina's presence at the scene, and the opportunity. All he needed was the final, definitive proof to connect Julian to the penthouse. "Get me a warrant for Julian Croft's house and his personal vehicle," Ike ordered. "We're not just looking for a weapon. We're looking for a second phone, hidden financials, anything that connects him to Serafina outside of business. This conspiracy is built on secrets. It's time to start turning over some rocks." He felt the thrill of the hunt, the adrenaline that came when the path finally became clear. The fog had lifted, revealing a landscape of pure, predatory evil. They were no longer chasing ghosts. They were hunting monsters. The raid on Julian Croft's home was executed with quiet, clinical precision at dawn. His house, a hyper-modern glass box perched in a wealthy enclave near Chastain Park, was a reflection of the man himself, sleek, sterile, and designed to keep the world at a distance. There was no sign of the frantic energy of a killer trying to cover his tracks. The place was immaculate. Ike led the search team, his instructions clear. They were to be methodical, to look for the subtle and the hidden. While one team went through financial documents in the home office and another examined his car, Ike focused on the master suite. The room was a palette of charcoal grays and blacks, as impersonal as a luxury hotel room. A king-size bed was made with military precision. The closet was a curated collection of expensive suits and designer shoes. It was the home of a man who lived a life of disciplined control. But Ike had learned that men like Julian always had a tell, a place where the mask slipped. He ran a gloved hand along the wall of the walk-in closet, tapping lightly. Near the back, behind a row of tailored suits, he heard it, a faint, hollow sound. He pushed on the wood panel, and it clicked open, revealing a hidden safe. The department's best technician had it open in under 20 minutes. Inside, there was no gun, no bloody clothes. There was something far more damning. There was a stack of bearer bonds totaling $250,000, untraceable and liquid. There were 2 fake passports with Julian's picture, but different names. And there was a burner phone. Ike powered it on. The phone was a treasure trove of conspiracy. It contained hundreds of text messages, photos, and emails between Julian and Serafina, a complete digital history of their affair and their plot. The messages were chilling in their casual cruelty. "Serafina, he told me tonight. The fool actually cried. It's almost too perfect." "Julian, the girl is getting greedy. She plans to ask for money. This will be our narrative, the enraged husband." "Serafina, are you ready, my love? After tomorrow, it's all ours." "Julian, I was born ready. He never should have trusted me. They had planned it for months." The text detailed how they would use Dominic's inevitable discovery of his HIV status as the trigger. Layla's blackmail attempt was an unexpected gift that made their story even more believable. There were messages from the night of the murder, coordinating their movements. Serafina's text from the gala's side exit, "On my way, handle the wine." And Julian's reply, "He'll be sound asleep when I arrive. See you on the other side, my queen." It was all there, a step-by-step blueprint for a perfect murder. Ike felt a cold fury settle over him as he read the messages. The sheer arrogance of it. The way they had manipulated and discarded human lives as if they were pieces on a chessboard. He looked around the sterile, beautiful house and saw it for what it was. A predator's den. The search of Julian's car yielded the final piece. Tucked into a hidden compartment in the trunk, wrapped in an oilcloth, was the murder weapon. A second Sig Sauer, unregistered, fitted with a silencer. Ballistics would confirm it was the gun used to kill both Dominic and Layla. Julian had brought his own weapon, used it, and then placed Dominic's legally registered gun in his hand to stage the suicide. It was meticulous, cold-blooded, and nearly flawless. While Ike was uncovering the conspiracy, Lena was at the Pierce estate, serving the warrant for Serafina's dress. She found Serafina in her dressing room, calmly sipping tea, as if she were expecting them. She showed no surprise, no fear. She simply gestured to her closet. "The cobalt blue one, I presume, detective." she asked, her voice dripping with icy condescension. "Do be careful with it. It was custom made." As Lena's team bagged the dress, they also executed the warrant for Serafina's personal effects. In a jewelry box filled with a king's ransom in gems, they found a small velvet pouch. Inside was a single diamond earring, the mate to the one Zeus had found behind the wine cabinet. The chain of evidence was now a closed, unbreakable loop. Back at the precinct, the evidence was laid out on a long table. The earring, the burner phone, the gun, the financial records, the dress. It was an overwhelming mountain of proof. The facade that Julian Croft and Serafina Pierce had so carefully constructed had been torn down, revealing the rotten, decaying structure beneath. Ike looked at the faces of his team. They were exhausted but energized. They had pulled a truth from the depths that had been deliberately buried. "Let's bring them in," Ike said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of finality. "Separately. It's time for the sonata to end." The hunt was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The precinct buzzed with a nervous, triumphant energy. Julian Croft and Serafina Pierce were brought in through a back entrance, away from the inevitable media circus that was already gathering out front. They were placed in 2 separate interrogation rooms at opposite ends of the hallway. They had arrived as partners in crime, confident and untouchable. Ike's strategy was to make sure they left as 2 isolated, terrified individuals, each one fighting for their own survival. He decided to start with Serafina. She sat at the bare metal table, her posture as regal as it had been in her drawing room. She looked at the two-way mirror with an expression of bored annoyance, as if the entire proceeding was a tedious bureaucratic inconvenience. Ike entered and sat opposite her, placing a single small evidence bag on the table between them. Inside was the cobalt blue cashmere fiber they had found on her earring. "This tiny thread tells a big story, Mrs. Pierce," he began, his voice calm. "It tells us you weren't at a gala all night. It tells us you were at your husband's penthouse." Serafina glanced at the bag and offered a thin, dismissive smile. "A thread? That's what this is about? My husband and I lived in the same city, detective. A thread could have come from anywhere." "It came from the dress you wore that night," Ike countered, "and it was found on an earring that you lost behind a wine cabinet in the same room where your husband was murdered." He slid a second evidence bag onto the table. It contained the earring itself. "This earring!" Her composure flickered, just for a second. I lost that earring weeks ago." "That's a lie," Ike said, his voice hardening. "And we both know it. The interesting thing is, Julian is already starting to remember things differently. He's in the other room, telling us a very compelling story about a plan that went wrong. A plan that was all your idea." This was the classic gambit, a lie to expose a larger truth. He had no idea what Julian was or wasn't saying, but he saw the seed of doubt he'd planted in her eyes, the fear that her partner was about to betray her to save himself. "Julian wouldn't," she whispered, the words betraying more uncertainty than defiance. "Wouldn't he?" Ike leaned forward. "He's looking at life in prison, Serafina. So are you. The first one to tell the truth gets the deal. That's how this works. He's painting you as a manipulative black widow who pushed him into it. Is that how you remember it?" He left her to stew in that toxic thought, walking out of the room without another word. He went straight to the interrogation room where Julian was waiting. Julian looked less composed than Serafina, a nervous energy radiating from him. He was a man used to controlling every variable, and now he was in a situation where he controlled nothing. Ike didn't bother with pleasantries. He tossed a printed transcript of the text messages from the burner phone onto the table. "I was born ready. See you on the other side, my queen," Ike read aloud. "Poetic. Did you feel like a king when you pulled the trigger?" Julian's face went pale. The carefully maintained mask of the grieving friend dissolved into the slack-jawed shock of a man who has been caught. "Where did you get that?" "From the phone you and Serafina used to plan your husband's murder," Ike said flatly. "She's already given us the whole story, by the way. How you were obsessed with her. How you couldn't stand living in Dominic's shadow. She says you forced her into it, threatened to expose her if she didn't help you." "That's a lie," Julian exploded, slamming his fist on the table. "She's lying. It was her idea from the beginning. She hated him. She hated the way he flaunted his affairs, the way he held the money over her head. She came to me." The dam had broken. The words poured out of him in a torrent of rage and self-pity. He confessed everything. He told them how he and Serafina had been planning it for almost a year, waiting for the right moment. The HIV diagnosis was a gift from God, in his words. He detailed how Serafina had left the gala and slipped into the penthouse. She had been the one to pour the wine, lacing Dominic's glass with a powerful sedative she'd gotten from a private doctor. He was groggy, barely conscious when I arrived, Julian admitted, his voice now a broken whisper. Layla was there, screaming at him about the money. She didn't even notice me come in at first. He described how he shot Layla first, the sound muted by the silencer. Dominic, in his drugged state, had tried to stand up, his eyes wide with confusion and betrayal. He looked at me, Julian said, his own eyes welling with tears. He knew, in his last moment, he knew. Julian had shot his best friend, his brother, in the head. Then, he and Serafina had calmly arranged the scene, wiping down surfaces, placing the gun in Dominic's hand before she slipped back to the gala to secure her alibi. It was a confession born of betrayal. He was not going to let Serafina pin it all on him. Armed with his statement, Ike returned to her room. Julian confessed, Ike said simply. He told us everything about the sedative, the silencer, the way you staged the scene together. Serafina Pierce listened, her face an unreadable mask of marble. There was no denial, no outburst. When Ike finished, a long, heavy silence filled the room. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw the truth in her cold blue eyes. It wasn't remorse. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. He was weak, she said, her voice dripping with venom. Dominic was weak, and Julian, he was even weaker. I chose the wrong partner. That was my only mistake. It was the confession of a true sociopath. Her only regret was getting caught. The sonata was over, its final ugly chord still ringing in the sterile air of the interrogation room. The conviction of Serafina Pierce and Julian Croft was a media sensation. The trial was a spectacle of wealth, sex, and betrayal that captivated Atlanta for weeks. The prosecution laid out the mountain of evidence, from a single diamond earring to a digital history of cold-blooded conspiracy. In the end, the jury took less than 4 hours to find them both guilty of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, their kingdom of greed reduced to an 8-by-10-foot cell. The city moved on, as it always does. The Pierce tech empire was sold off in pieces, its legacy forever tainted. The sovereign penthouse got a new owner who probably never knew the ghosts that haunted its marble floors. The case files were stamped closed and sent to the archives. For the Atlanta PD, it was a major victory, a high-profile win that made headlines. But for Ike Thorne, there was no sense of triumph. He sat in his office late one night, weeks after the verdict, the city lights painting patterns on his wall. He looked at the now empty whiteboard, where the faces of the dead and the guilty had once been displayed. This hadn't been a case about a crime of passion or a moment of rage. It was a story about something colder, something more insidious. It was about the rot that can grow behind a facade of perfection. He thought about the masks they all wore. Dominic Pierce, the powerful tycoon, wore the mask of success to hide the insecurities that led him to infidelity. Layla Sands wore the mask of a carefree party girl to hide her desperation and fear. And Serafina and Julian wore the most convincing masks of all, the grieving widow and the loyal friend, hiding the hearts of predators beneath. They were all characters in a grand, tragic opera of their own making. His partner, Lena, leaned against his doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You still thinking about them?" she asked, handing him a cup. "I'm thinking about how close they came to getting away with it," Ike said, taking a sip. "If Zeus hadn't found that earring, if we had just accepted the easy story, they'd be on a yacht somewhere, toasting their new life." "But they didn't," Lena said, "because you didn't let it go. Stubbornness isn't a virtue, Lena," he said with a wry smile. "Sometimes it is," she replied. Ike looked out the window at the sprawling, indifferent city. He had brought the killers to justice, but it felt like a hollow victory. 2 people were dead, and 2 more had thrown their lives away, all for a little more money and a little more power. The case served as a brutal, chilling reminder of a lesson he had learned long ago. The most dangerous monsters aren't the ones who lurk in the shadows. They are the ones who sit beside us, smiling, hiding their true nature behind a mask of civility. The true tragedy of the Peachtree Penthouse case wasn't just the 2 lives lost in a storm of greed and betrayal. It was the stark realization that the capacity for such cold-blooded evil often resides not in strangers, but in the people we trust the most. A wife, a best friend. The final lingering truth of the case was a simple and terrifying one. Trust is a fragile thing, and sometimes the deepest betrayals come not with a bang, but with a whisper, a secret plan, and a perfectly executed lie. And justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't always feel like a victory. Sometimes it just feels like a sad, necessary end to a terrible song.